For generations, one explanation dominated the scientific account of Navajo origins: a long migration south from the Subarctic into the American Southwest. It was clean, it was accepted, and for 100 years nobody had the tools to actually test it. Then, in 2025, a genetics lab tested it and found the part of the story that had been missing all along. The Navajo Nation has nearly 400,000 enrolled members and a homeland roughly the size of West Virginia. Their language ties them to the edge of the Arctic. Their ancestry, the new data suggested, was far more southwestern than anyone had expected. To understand what changed, you have to understand what everyone believed first. The Navajo call themselves DNA, the people. Their language, Diné Bizad, belongs to the Athabascan family, spoken thousands of miles north in the boreal forests of western Canada and interior Alaska. Nothing about it resembles the Pueblo languages spoken around Navajo communities today, and that distance became the entire foundation of the migration story. Somewhere between the late 1400s and early 1500s, ancestral Athabascan speakers moved south out of the Subarctic and into the Four Corners. A small founding population leaves the north, travels for generations, and arrives still speaking a version of the language it left with. Clean story. One problem: the migrants left almost no trail. No line of abandoned camps connects Alaska to Arizona. No continuous chain of tools or sites. Mobile hunting families carried language and memory, not monuments. And for decades that silence was written off as an artifact of how lightly they lived, not as a flaw in the story itself. The first real surprise was an absence, and it made the question bigger, not smaller. Some archaeologists argued for a much earlier arrival, reading the silence as evidence of a population too mobile to leave ruins behind. Others insisted the record was thin, simply because the migration itself came late. Neither side had a way to settle it. It was the problem both sides kept returning to, and underneath it sat the real question: could the ground itself ever answer it? The first real test came in 2003, when researchers examined mitochondrial DNA, the line passed only from mother to child, across the American Southwest. It told a familiar story. Navajo populations carried signatures pointing back through the Americas to Northeast Asia. Familiar, but not identical. Some maternal lineages were more common among people who had never left the Southwest at all. This suggested that women carrying local southwestern ancestry had entered the emerging population. 5 years later, a second study examined the Y chromosome, the paternal line. Researchers typed 231 new samples from 12 populations, then combined that with previously published data, reaching 724 samples across 26 native populations. The pattern held: a small northern founder population, a genetic bottleneck, expanding fast once it reached the Southwest, a new population taking shape through contact and later admixture as it expanded south. But early genetic tools could only see two narrow threads pulled out of an entire genome: one maternal line, one paternal line. Everything else stayed dark. To read the rest, researchers needed whole genome data, and they needed it from people who had actually lived in the Southwest before the migration happened. That data didn't exist yet. For almost 2 decades, it simply couldn't be checked. Then came Picuris Pueblo in northern New Mexico. The tribe initiated the research themselves and kept control of the data, a condition written into the agreement before a single sample was sequenced. Scientists recovered genomes from 16 ancient individuals buried at Picuris. alongside 13 present-day tribal members, and compared all of it against 590 ancient and modern genomes from across the Americas and Siberia. The immediate goal wasn't even the Navajo question. Picuris leaders wanted to understand their own community's continuity, their own ties to Chaco Canyon, roughly 270 kilometers to the west. The tribal governor later called the decision to open that door a difficult one, and called what came back life-changing. Because the ancient Picuris genomes did something nobody had planned for. They built a clock inside the Southwest itself, precise enough to test the Athabascan arrival directly, instead of guessing at it from language alone. And the clock gave an answer. None of the Picuris individuals who lived before 1535 carried any detectable Athabascan ancestry. Not a trace. The signal shows up only in Picuris people living today. That absence provided some of the strongest genetic support yet for a late Southern Athabascan arrival, most likely after 1500, into a Southwest that was already fully inhabited. That would have been enough to end the story. It didn't. When researchers modeled where that sampled Southern Athabascan ancestry actually came from, a single northern source didn't fit the data. The best-fitting model needed two sources, a northern Athabascan population and a Puebloan one. The surprise wasn't that Puebloan ancestry showed up at all. It was how much of it there was. Most Southern Athabascan ancestry traced not to the north, but to the Puebloan source. The northern migrants passed on their language far more widely than they passed on their ancestry. Sit with that for a second. A northern language survived, even as the population carrying it became predominantly southwestern in ancestry. That doesn't mean every Navajo person carries the same proportions, and it doesn't turn genetics into a test of who belongs to the nation. Ancestry is not citizenship, and it was never built to answer that question. A small migrant group became part of a much larger population taking shape across the Southwest. The results suggest that language spread more widely than the ancestry of the original northern migrants, carried onward through marriage, alliance, adoption, and everyday contact, while the genomes carrying those words south grew steadily more local with every generation. The culture absorbed the same way the genome did. Maize, beans, squash, cotton, and tobacco entered community life. Weaving became one of the most recognized DNA arts, absorbed from neighbors, then rebuilt inside a distinctly DNA system of kinship and meaning. Sheep and horses came later, after Spanish contact, and transformed DNA life again. Everything absorbed got reworked into something distinctly DNA. Here's the part DNA can't answer. It cannot say whether any single connection came through marriage, captivity, adoption, or refuge. It records biological relationships, not consent, memory, or belonging, which is exactly why genetic history has to be read beside oral tradition, never instead of it. Southern Athabascan traditions already describe encounters with Pueblo communities. Ethnographers and linguists have separately documented Puebloan clan names and loanwords inside Diné Bizad. The genome aligned with something that had been sitting in plain sight the whole time, a history the community had already been telling, that the DNA just caught up to. For generations, that order was reversed. Indigenous DNA was collected first and explained later, which is part of why the Navajo Nation restricts genetic research on tribal land today. The Picuris Project worked the other way around. The tribe initiated it, controlled the data, and held final approval over publication, a distinction that matters as much as anything found in the genome itself. So, what did the DNA actually reveal? The migration from the north still holds, and nothing about this erases it. What the data added is what happened after. A small population arrived in a world that was already full of people, and the two did not stay separate. They mixed and built something neither had been on its own, a southwestern people shaped by contact across generations, carrying a northern language and a southwestern history. The old map showed one arrow, moving from north to south. The genome shows what happened when that arrow finally reached the people already standing there, a small band of newcomers, a landscape of working fields and settled families, and 5 centuries later, 16 sets of ancient remains and 13 living volunteers who let a lab read what their ancestors never had the chance to write down. They did not simply arrive in the Southwest. They became a people there.